Hey, I am Lauren McGhee, and I will be providing the book review for Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Little background on Paulo. He was born to a middle-class family in Brazil, but unfortunately, due to the Great Depression, his family severely struggled with hunger and poverty. And Paulo found that he was 4 grades behind in his education because not due to his lack of intellect, but because his belly was just hungry. And this created this drive to fight against oppression, which he was experiencing from his Brazilian government and poverty. And so this brought him to a career of teaching and working with the poverty and poverty-stricken and the illiterate. With his work in this field, during the coup d'etat in Brazil, he was actually seen as a traitor and was imprisoned for a while and then exiled for a time. But during this exile is when he wrote the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, with more than 1 million copies sold worldwide and many awards, including one notable one, the UNESCO Prize for Peace Education. Paulo is seen as one of the most influential, if not the most influential person and book from Pedagogy of the Oppressed in the conversation of pedagogy and the pedagogy movement in general. Few key ideas from the book. One is my most favorite, is banking education, which is the concept of looking at students as empty deposits or empty banks that need to be deposited knowledge. And then the student is measured by spitting out that knowledge or withdrawing that knowledge back out. So looking as this cycle of putting in knowledge, taking out knowledge, and vice versa. The second key idea is the dialogical versus anti-dialogical approach. Dialogical being a conversation with students and inviting students into the conversation. And on a larger scale, the government inviting people into the conversation, as opposed to anti-dialogical, which is really just a power structure of the oppressor creates a decision or makes a decision, and the oppressed just lives under that decision and is just reacting. And so this concept, according to Paulo, is the difference between oppression and freedom. The third key idea, which is a little difficult to say, is conscientizzação. And conscientizzação is essentially just critical thinking, critical consciousness. So training individuals to detect the discrepancies, to really just eye out the contradictions in their lives, socially and politically, but not just leaving it there. Training them to look for it, and then also training them to problem solve and to respond with action against these contradictions in their lives. A few criticisms of the book, some of which I was surprised by. The first being sexism. I was very surprised by this criticism once I found it. Paulo was criticized for not including the oppression of feminists or other minority groups, really anyone that wasn't poverty-stricken and oppressed in his terms. He was also criticized for using more patriarchal language as opposed to being inclusive of all genders. The second, which for me was very noticeable, was the language used in Paulo's book. There is this bit of irony between who Paulo was working his entire life to serve, which is, of course, the illiterate, the poverty-stricken. But in writing this book, the language and verbiage that he used was highly, highly academic. So it seemed as if the book he was writing about was not accessible to the people he was writing for. Another criticism is the lack of application of this book in the United States. That really we do not experience oppression here in the way that other countries like Brazil, like Paulo's experience did. And so a lack of being able to apply these concepts to the United States because we just do not experience the same types of governmental issues that Paulo did, for example. And the fourth is practical application. So, of course, a lot of higher ideological thinking in terms of banking education, conscientizzação, etc. But the book was a bit lacking and light in providing tangible applications for the instructor, for the oppressed, for the oppressor. So a little lacking in that area. I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, and a couple of things that I took away that I will take in my career moving forward. One is just the concept of banking education. I had known this concept internally for a while, but Paulo's book provided verbiage and a title around it. I have also said there is a vast difference between being intellectual and being a good student. Because in banking education, in my public education experience, you are rewarded for memorization more than problem solving. And that is a downfall of banking education, which I learned just through thinking through what this book provided. And the second learning for me was critical consciousness. This concept that I have severely taken for granted, because in our country, access to information has always been around, and we are encouraged and celebrated for working against the grain, working against the man, working against these contradictions that we see in our lives. I don't believe really the United States has ever lacked in that sort of information, that access, much like other countries have. So those are my major learnings that I took away. A few strengths of the book, which there are many, but a few to note, is Paulo's resilience and his experience just bleeding through every word of the book. His resilience brought him to higher thinking that we can now appreciate through his book. The second is he challenges. He challenges the norm. He challenges what we are comfortable with, challenges our potential fear of freedom. And he also ties together politics and government and education, which is not a linear thought I had had before. A few limitations, in my opinion, of the book, and I'll preface by saying I think some of these are potentially unpopular opinions. One is the term oppression and using that word so distinctly. I think sometimes teaching people that they are oppressed can be dangerous and cause unnecessary hatred and divide, as opposed to the concept of conscientious disavowal, training people to learn if they are oppressed, as opposed to using the media, books, etc., other channels to tell them they are oppressed, and then just taking that concept at heart and not investigating it further. Another is the concept of banking education in the United States and applying this, and really just this hard line drawn in the sand that Paulo did, that banking education equals bad and other forms of education equal good. I think, like most things in life, there are things that we can take from banking education that could be applied, such as teaching young children, using a banking education approach on them, because in fact they are empty at that point. And so to some degree, we do have to treat them as knowledge deposits in hopes that in the future they will use that knowledge to problem solve and to work against and to look at those contradictions in their lives. We are also on the cutting edge of technological innovation and an economic superpower, and I would like to think that our education system has something to do with that. And lastly, there are many applications of this book, and this may feel like an easy answer, but I think really every concept in this book is applicable today. In the world of training and development, using that dialogical approach is absolutely necessary to engaging with the instructor and the student. And lastly, in the world of COVID-19 virtual learning, being able to have that problem-posing education, like Paulo mentioned, is so vitally important, because as instructors, it can be very easy to slip solely into banking education through virtual learning, as opposed to inviting the student into the conversation. So I hope you enjoy this book review, and thank you for this opportunity to read the book.